The sound of his fork tapping lightly against the rim of a champagne flute silenced the room. My hands, the same hands that had brought order to his financial chaos for 40 years, suddenly felt cold and empty. "To my son, Matthew," my husband's voice boomed, his smile wide enough to swallow the world. "Who, as of today, will be taking over the company I built myself, from the ground up." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was a dry, rustling sound, like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin lid. My coffin. 40 years of my life, every sleepless night over his chaotic receipts, every tax loophole he later bragged about at parties, every payroll met on time when he swore we were bankrupt vanished in that noise. He hadn't just forgotten, he had erased. I watched. I saw Matthew, my stepson, rise, his face glowing with pride. He shook his father's hand, embraced him. Neither of them looked my way. I was sitting at a table near the stage, not the main family table, but with the secondary managers. For a better view, my husband had explained earlier. I understood now it wasn't a better view. It was a witness box, not a partner's chair. Someone at my table, a young analyst, leaned towards me. "You must be incredibly proud, Mrs. Henderson," he said, smiling sincerely. "You've done so much for this company." I only gave the slightest nod. I couldn't speak, because in that same moment, my husband, raising his glass again, added with a laugh, "And of course, thank you to my wife, who kept our household running all these years so I could work in peace." A few people clapped politely. They only heard words of gratitude. I heard the final nail. Household. That's what he called 40 years of my intellect, my labor, my loyalty. He had demoted me to a housewife in front of the company I had actually built. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I slowly lifted my glass of water, looked directly at my husband across the hall, and took a silent sip. He met my gaze, surprised for a moment. He expected to see tears of gratitude. He saw something else, something cold, something he had never seen before. Because an accountant knows everything, you learn to anticipate liabilities. He thought the real story was in the leather-bound ledgers I placed on his desk every year. He never knew about the second set of books, the ones I kept in a fireproof box under the floorboards in my closet. They weren't just numbers. They were a 40-year record of my real title, founding partner. He thought he was passing on a legacy. I was about to hand him an invoice. The applause finally subsided, replaced by the low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware on fine china. The sound felt distant, as if it were happening in another room, to other people. My world had narrowed to the polished surface of my small table, the plain, heavy water glass in my hand, and the stage across the hall where my life's work was being publicly auctioned off to the lowest bidder. My husband's ego. It had started earlier in the evening, the first subtle tremor before the earthquake. When we arrived, Arthur, my Arthur of 4 decades, had guided me through the elegantly dressed crowd. His hand was on my back, a familiar gesture, but it wasn't steering me toward the long, ornate head table where a place card with Mrs. Eliza Henderson should have been. It was steering me past it. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with the scent of expensive whiskey. "Darling, I've put you at a wonderful table with some of our key managers. You'll have a much better view of the proceedings from there." I didn't protest. I simply followed his lead, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. I felt the curious glances of our oldest employees, the ones who knew, the ones who remembered me working late into the night, my desk buried under spreadsheets while Arthur was out networking, which was his word for charming potential clients over golf and steak dinners. They saw me being led away from the center of power, and their smiles became a little tighter, their eyes a little more questioning. This was the first act, stratification. He wasn't just seating me, he was segregating me. Visually, publicly, he was classifying me as staff. A high-level employee, perhaps, but an employee nonetheless. Not family. Not a partner. I took my seat between a senior sales manager I'd known for 20 years and the young analyst, Noah. The tablecloth here felt different standard hotel linen, not the fine damask of the head table. The silverware was lighter, small details, insignificant to anyone else, but to a person who had approved every single expense for 40 years, they were a declaration. He had categorized me, assigned me a budget, and placed me accordingly. Then came the speech, the main event, the public execution. When Arthur tapped his glass, a hush fell over the room. He stood in the spotlight, a master of his domain. He spoke of humble beginnings, of risks taken, of a vision he alone possessed. He painted a masterpiece of a self-made man, and with every brushstroke, he painted me out of the picture. My contributions were not forgotten. They were methodically and deliberately paved over with his own mythology. Then came the first killing blow, to my son Matthew, who will be taking over the company I built myself. The words hung in the air. I built myself. It was such a clean, simple lie, so audacious in its completeness. I felt the air leave my lungs, not in a gasp of shock, but in a slow, controlled release. This was no slip of the tongue. This was the official narrative. The applause, that dry, rustling sound, was the sound of my professional obituary being read aloud. I kept my face a perfect mask of serene composure. Inside, a switch was flipped. The part of me that had been a wife, a partner, a supporter, went dark. A different part came online. The part that audited, that calculated, that found discrepancies and hunted them down without mercy. It was then that Noah, the young analyst beside me, leaned in. He was barely 25, a prodigy with numbers. I'd personally reviewed his hiring file. "You must be so proud, Mrs. Henderson," he'd said, his youthful face open and sincere. And then he added the words that served as the prosecution's first exhibit. "I still go over those financial models you built for the '08 crisis. They were genius. You've done so much for this company." His words were a validation. A small, bright candle of truth in a room dark with lies. He saw. The real ones, the ones who paid attention to the work and not the performance. They saw. And Arthur knew they saw. That's what made his next word so exquisitely cruel. It was an act not of ignorance, but of dominance. He raised his glass again, his smile widening, and of course, thank you to my wife, who kept our household running all these years so I could work in peace. Reclassification. The demotion was now public record. He hadn't just erased me, he'd replaced my 40-year career with a caricature. The financial architect of a multi-million-dollar corporation was now, officially, a simple homemaker. The polite, confused applause that followed was the sound of people trying to reconcile the woman Noah had just praised with the one Arthur had just dismissed. My gaze drifted from my husband to my stepson. Matthew was beaming. He stood beside his father, the perfect image of a proud heir. He had grown up in our house. He had seen me at the dining table at 2 a.m., surrounded by ledgers. He had brought me coffee during all-night sessions before quarterly tax deadlines. He knew. He knew the truth just as well as Arthur did, but as he stood there, bathed in the glow of his inheritance, he did not look at me. He did not offer a single glance of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of shared history. His silence was not ignorance. It was consent. He was the chief beneficiary of this crime, and his acceptance of the throne was his signature on the fraudulent document of my life. This was the final act. Elimination. I was no longer in the line of succession. I was a footnote in a history he and his father were actively rewriting. My eyes locked onto Arthur's across the room. He was looking at me now, a fleeting, triumphant glance. He was checking to see the effect of his words. He expected tears. He expected a broken woman, grateful for the scraps of acknowledgement he'd thrown her. He was a poor strategist. He never understood that the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. I did not give him tears. I gave him nothing. I slowly, deliberately reached for my glass. It wasn't a delicate champagne flute, but a solid, heavy tumbler of water. I curled my fingers around its cool, smooth surface. The weight felt good in my hand. It felt real, solid, like a fact. I raised the glass, not in a toast, but in a silent acknowledgement. My eyes never left his. I saw the flicker of confusion in his expression. This was not the reaction he had scripted. Then I took a sip. The water was cold and clear. It had no taste, no sentiment. It was pure, elemental. As it slid down my throat, it wasn't quenching a thirst, it was extinguishing a fire. The hot, messy flames of love and loyalty and hurt were gone. In their place, something crystalline and cold began to form. A plan. A strategy that had been dormant for years. A contingency protocol for a betrayal I had always known was a statistical probability. An accountant knows. You account for everything. Depreciation, amortization, betrayal. Arthur looked away first. He turned back to his son, his adoring crowd. He thought the moment had passed. He thought he had won. But I was still watching him, my face impassive. The young analyst, Noah, glanced at me, a worried frown on his face. He'd heard the lie. He knew. I offered him a small, tight smile. It didn't reach my eyes. My eyes were busy. They were scanning the room not as a guest, but as a hostile bidder at an auction, identifying assets, calculating valuations, planning the opening move. The real books weren't the leather-bound trophies in Arthur's office. They were in a fireproof safe under my floorboards. 40 years of my overtime, my strategies, my intellectual property, all logged, dated, and valued. Every idea he'd ever claimed as his own was traced back to my original memos. Every crisis averted was cross-referenced with my reports. It wasn't a diary. It was a corporate ledger of a silent partnership. He thought this party was a coronation. He had no idea it was a deposition. And I had just entered a 40-year-long paper trail into evidence. The war had begun. And the one thing my husband never learned about business is that you never, ever go to war with your accountant. We know where all the bodies are buried, and we keep meticulous records. The sun rose the next morning, pouring liquid gold into the master bedroom I had shared with Arthur for 32 years. It was a beautiful, offensively cheerful morning. I had slept for precisely 3 hours, a deep, dreamless state that felt less like rest and more like a system reboot. The hot rage from the night before had cooled, solidifying into something far more dangerous: purpose. Arthur was already gone. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets barely disturbed. A note on his pillow read, "Meeting with Matthew early to go over the transition. Big day. See you tonight." The exclamation point felt like a final, tiny insult. He was living in the future he had written for himself, oblivious to the fact that his history was about to be audited. I didn't linger in the room. I moved with an efficiency that had become second nature over 40 years of deadlines and crises. I showered, the hot water washing away the last vestiges of the woman from the party. I didn't put on one of my usual comfortable cardigans or elegant dresses. I went to the back of my closet and retrieved a charcoal gray business suit I hadn't worn in years. It was sharp, severe, and fit perfectly. It was armor. Downstairs, the house was silent. Our home, usually a place of warmth and curated comfort, felt like a museum exhibit. I walked past the family photos on the mantelpiece. In one, Arthur had his arms around me and a teenage Matthew. We looked happy. I looked at it now and saw a board of directors. And last night, I had been officially notified my position had been made redundant. I made coffee, a dark, bitter roast, and drank it standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn. I wasn't admiring the view. I was assessing an asset. By 9 a.m., I was walking across the cold marble floor of the downtown branch of Sterling National Bank. The air was cool and smelled of old money and security. I didn't approach a teller. I walked directly to the discreet door marked Private Vaults. The guard nodded at me, his expression unchanged. I was a familiar face here. He thought I was Mrs. Henderson, wife of the successful entrepreneur. He had no idea I was here as Eliza Henderson, sole proprietor of a 40-year-old case for corporate theft. The vault manager led me into the chilled, silent room, the walls lined with stainless steel doors. He used his key, then I used mine. He slid out the long, heavy box. Number 713 placed it on the narrow table in the private viewing room and left, closing the heavy door behind me with a solid, satisfying thunk. For a moment, I just looked at the box. It was my ark, the repository of a lifetime's truth. I lifted the lid. There they were. Not dusty, forgotten journals, but 12 immaculate ledgers, bound in simple, functional black leather. No names, just years embossed on the spine in small gold digits. The second set of books. My voice, my real work, codified in the universal language of numbers. Beside the ledgers lay a large manila envelope. I opened it. Inside was not another document, but a single, smaller, flatter key. I closed box 713, slid it back into its slot, and then pointed to another box further down the wall. Number 942, the manager, summoned by a small button, repeated the process. This box was lighter. Inside, there were no ledgers. There were property deeds, bearer bonds purchased through a holding company I'd set up a decade ago, and a single, encrypted hard drive. This was not the evidence. This was the war chest. I took only the hard drive and the key to box 713. I didn't need the books themselves. They had been digitized, triple backed up, and encrypted years ago. The physical copies were merely ceremonial at this point. I didn't go home. I didn't go to the office. I walked to a small, anonymous coffee shop 3 blocks from the bank, a place with steel tables and no memory. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a table in the corner, and placed my phone before me. My fingers were steady. My heart rate was as calm as if I were about to reconcile a petty cash report. I dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. A calm baritone devoid of surprise answered. "Read." "Caleb, it's Eliza," I said, my voice low and even. There was no need for pleasantries. We had rehearsed this. There was a slight pause on the other end, the sound of a man sitting up straighter in his expensive leather chair. "Eliza, I was wondering when you'd call." "Activate protocol, Hestia," I said. The code name was a small, private irony. Hestia, the goddess of the hearth and home. All documents are in your email, time-stamped 9:30 this morning. The access key for the final archive is Nolite te bastirdes carborundorum. I expect the draft of the lawsuit by end of day. Caleb didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer sympathy. He was not my friend. He was my weapon, and I had just pulled the trigger. "Understood, Eliza," he said, his tone shifting into the clipped, precise cadence of a litigator on the hunt. Glad we're finally starting. The petition for declaratory judgment will be filed tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. The motion to freeze all personal and corporate assets will be the first item on the docket. They won't be able to buy a cup of coffee with company funds by lunchtime. Good, I said. It was the only word that mattered. They won't see it coming, Eliza, he added. I looked out the window at the people rushing by on the sidewalk, each living their own simple, uncomplicated lives. No, Caleb, I replied softly before hanging up. He never once looked at the liabilities. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The celebration was over. The self-congratulatory speeches were finished. The real transition of power was about to begin. The books were the history. The lawsuit would be the future. And court was now in session. The morning sun streamed into Arthur's top-floor office, glinting off the crystal of a half-empty bottle of 2 5-year-old scotch and 2 glasses that sat on the corner of his vast mahogany desk. It was a monument to victory. Arthur leaned back in his leather throne, a picture of paternal satisfaction, while Matthew paced excitedly before the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city spread below them like a kingdom. I still can't believe it, Matthew said, his voice buzzing with the energy of a man who had just been handed the world. The board meeting was a formality. They love the transition plan. Of course they do, Arthur chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It's my plan. Solid, decisive, no room for sentiment. He took a sip. Speaking of which, your stepmother was a little quiet last night, probably emotional. These things can be hard for women, the changing of the guard. Matthew stopped pacing and turned, his expression a careful mixture of concern and ambition. She'll come around, Dad. She just needs time to adjust to her new role. More time for her garden and book club. Exactly, Arthur said, pointing a finger at his son. That's leadership, understanding the emotional landscape. They shared a look of mutual, unassailable confidence. They were the architects of the future, secure in their power, their legacy, their story. A sharp, professional rap on the office door broke their self-congratulatory bubble. It wasn't Arthur's long-time assistant, who always knocked with a softer, more deferential rhythm. Come in, Arthur called, annoyed by the interruption. The door opened to reveal a man who did not belong in this world of expensive suits and old money. He wore a cheap blazer that didn't quite fit his shoulders, and his face was a study in practiced neutrality. He held a thick stack of documents in one hand. Arthur Henderson? The man asked, his voice flat, his eyes scanning the room. Yes, Arthur said, his tone dripping with impatience. If it's about a delivery, leave it with my assistant. I can't, sir. I have to deliver this to you personally. The man took a step into the room, his gaze shifting to Matthew. And to Matthew Henderson. He walked to the desk, placing 2 identical stacks of paper on the polished mahogany surface. The heavy thud of the paper was the only sound in the room. Matthew looked at his father, confused. What is this? Some disgruntled supplier? Arthur waved a dismissive hand. Probably. A nuisance lawsuit. He glared at the man. All right, you've delivered it. Now you can go. The man didn't move. You've both been served, he stated, as if announcing the time. I'd recommend you look at the top page. The temporary restraining order is effective immediately. The words restraining order hung in the air, so alien to this environment that for a moment they didn't register. Arthur scoffed, picking up the top document as if it were contaminated. Matthew did the same. The bold black letters at the top of the page were brutally clear. In the district court of Petition for declaratory judgment and injunctive relief plaintiff, Eliza Henderson defendants, Arthur Henderson, Matthew Henderson, Henderson Innovations, LLC. Arthur's breath hitched. He scanned the first paragraph, his eyes widening in disbelief. Words and phrases leaped out at him, each one a separate, staggering blow. Claim of co-founding partnership. Undocumented 40-year equity stake. Systematic appropriation of intellectual and financial capital. Matthew's face had gone sheet white. He was staring at a different page. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Dad, look at this." He held up a single sheet of paper. It was the order, the one the man had mentioned. At the top, in large, unforgiving type, it said, "Emergency order granting temporary asset freeze." Arthur snatched the paper from his son's hand. His corporate and personal bank accounts, his brokerage funds, his credit lines all frozen, effective immediately. Pending a hearing to determine the plaintiff's 51% controlling interest in the company. 51%. The illusion of power evaporated in an instant. The celebratory scotch turned to poison in his stomach. This wasn't a nuisance. This wasn't a joke. This was an invasion. A coup. "What the hell is this?" Arthur roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous crimson. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy. He stabbed at the screen, dialing Eliza's number. It went straight to voicemail. The cheerful, recorded voice of his wife felt like a mocking laugh from a ghost. He spun around, directing his fury at the only target available. "This is insane! She's my wife!" he yelled at the process server, who was standing impassively by the door. "This is some kind of mistake." The man simply shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference that was more infuriating than any argument. "I just deliver the papers, sir. My job is done." He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the two most powerful men in the company standing in the silent, sunlit ruins of their mourning. Arthur stared at the stack of documents on his desk. It was no longer just paper. It was a declaration of war, a meticulously documented, legally binding war, launched from an enemy he never even knew existed. Miles away, in a quiet, steel and glass conference room, Eliza Henderson sat across a polished table from Caleb Reed. Sunlight streamed through the window here, too, but it was a cool, analytical light. She held a porcelain cup of coffee in her hands, her posture perfectly serene. She was reviewing a preliminary financial audit of a company she already knew better than anyone. Caleb's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. "The server has confirmed delivery," he said, his voice calm. "Your phone will likely start ringing." Eliza looked up from the report, her eyes clear and focused. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, the same gesture from the night before. But here, in the quiet of her new command center, its meaning was absolute. "Let it ring," she said. The conference room at Reed, Albright, and Finch was a temple of calculated aggression. It was a space designed to communicate power in its most sterile, undeniable form. The air was chilled to a precise temperature that discouraged comfort and encouraged brevity. The 20-foot-long table was a single, flawless slab of obsidian black granite, so highly polished it reflected the grim, gray sky outside the panoramic window like a dark mirror. There were no paintings on the steel-gray walls, no plants, no personal touches. It was a room where sentiment came to die. And at the head of this table, Saturday. My posture was perfect, my hands resting lightly on the cool granite, one on either side of a single untouched glass of iced water. I was the queen on a chessboard of my own design, and I had already moved my opponent into an impossible position. I hadn't said a word since they entered. I didn't need to. My silence was the most powerful statement in the room. Across the vast expanse of black stone sat the remnants of my old life. Arthur, Matthew, and their lawyer, a man named Jennings, whose perpetually worried expression suggested he specialized in damage control, not victory. They looked small, swallowed by the scale of the room. Arthur's expensive suit, the one he wore for triumphs, hung on him like a shroud. His face, usually ruddy with confidence, was a blotchy, pale canvas of disbelief and fury. Matthew was a ghost, his youthful arrogance completely stripped away, leaving behind the terrified boy who now understood the kingdom he was promised was built on quicksand. Jennings was shuffling papers, his movements fussy and uncertain. He was a man out of his depth, a family lawyer brought to a corporate war. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the cathedral-like silence. "Mr. Reed," he began, his voice attempting a tone of reasonable negotiation. "My clients are, of course, shocked and deeply hurt by these allegations. We are here today in good faith to find an amicable path forward, to resolve this as a family, without further escalating what is clearly a painful misunderstanding." Caleb Reed, who sat to my right, didn't even glance at Jennings' papers. He let the word family hang in the air for a moment, letting its absurdity curdle in the cold atmosphere. Then he leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled. "Mr. Jennings," Caleb's voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. "Let me be unequivocally clear, so that no time is wasted. This is not a negotiation. This is not a discussion. This is a debriefing. You are not here to find a path forward. You are here to receive the terms of your client's surrender." Jennings' mouth opened, then closed. He looked at his clients, who seemed to shrink even further in their chairs. Arthur could not contain himself. The illusion of his power was being dismantled before his eyes, and he reacted with the only tool he had left, bluster. He slammed a hand on the table, the sound a dull, fleshy thud on the unyielding granite. "This is insane," he bellowed, his voice hoarse. "Eliza, what is this? After 40 years? After the life we built? The home? Our son?" He gestured wildly at Matthew, as if presenting him as evidence of a shared history. "You throw it all away for what? Money? Is that all our life meant to you?" I met his gaze across the table. For the first time, I felt nothing. No sting of betrayal, no echo of old affection, no flicker of pity. I was an auditor looking at a fraudulent account. His words were just more bad data. Our life. I mentally translated it. My 40 years of uncompensated labor. Our home. My primary and secondary office. Our son. The beneficiary of my stolen legacy. He was trying to appeal to a woman who no longer existed. He had killed her 2 nights ago, in a room full of people, with a toast and a condescending smile. The woman sitting here now was the executor of her estate. I didn't answer him. I simply gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod to Caleb. It was his stage. Caleb straightened, placing a hand on the object that sat before him on the table. It was a binder, nearly 6 inches thick, bound in stark black leather. It was the physical manifestation of my second set of books, the raw data of my life's work translated into the brutal, irrefutable language of the law. It was my declaration, articulated over 500 pages of evidence. "Mr. Henderson," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a formal, almost surgical tone, "your appeals to sentiment are irrelevant to the matter at hand. The matter at hand is a legal reality. you have ignored for 4 decades. We are here to rectify that. The lawsuit filed against you is based on the established legal doctrine of factual partnership, a doctrine that states when one party contributes labor, skill, and capital to an enterprise with the shared intention of making a profit, a partnership exists, whether it was ever formally written down or not. He paused, letting the legal weight of the words settle into the room. Jennings shifted uncomfortably. He knew the doctrine. He also knew he had no defense against it. For 40 years, Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on Arthur. Mrs. Henderson served not as your housekeeper, as you so publicly declared, but as the de facto chief financial officer, chief strategist, and operational architect of Henderson Innovations. She managed every financial detail, from payroll to tax strategy. She developed the investment models that allowed for your key expansions. She navigated the company through 2 recessions, while you, by your own admission, were simply the public face of the operation. Caleb tapped the enormous binder with a single finger. This, he said, the word landing with the finality of a gavel, is the evidence. It is what Mrs. Henderson refers to as the second set of books. It is a contemporaneous 40-year record of her work. It contains every financial model she ever built, copies of every strategy memo she ever wrote, every crisis she single-handedly averted, and a detailed forensic accounting of the value she created, value for which she was never compensated as a partner. He let that sink in. I watched the blood drain from Arthur's face. He was finally understanding. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a calculation, a reckoning. Therefore, Caleb's voice was now devoid of any warmth, as cold and hard as the table between us. On behalf of my client, the co-founder and majority partner of Henderson Innovations, we are demanding the following non-negotiable terms. First, the immediate and formal recognition of Mrs. Henderson's 51% controlling equity stake in the company. Matthew made a small, choked sound. 51%. The number was a death sentence to his inheritance. Second, Caleb went on, ignoring him. Mr. Arthur Henderson will tender his resignation as CEO, effective immediately. Mr. Matthew Henderson will be removed from his newly appointed position. A new board, to be appointed by the majority shareholder, will oversee the transition. Arthur stared at me now, his eyes pleading, desperate. He was looking for a crack in my composure, a sign of the woman he thought he knew. He found nothing but a polished, impenetrable wall. He had built his empire on my silence, and now my silence would be his ruin. This island, Jennings stammered. This is an outrageous overreach. We will fight this in court for years. Caleb smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, placid smile. You are welcome to try, he said softly, but you should be aware of the terms of refusal. You have 48 hours to accept this offer in its entirety. If you refuse or attempt to challenge it, at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, a second phase of our strategy will be activated. He leaned forward again, his voice a low, conspiratorial threat. We will be forced to submit our findings, the entirety of this binder, to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second set of books doesn't just prove Mrs. Henderson's partnership, Mr. Jennings. It also meticulously documents 40 years of what could be creatively interpreted as tax irregularities, asset misrepresentations, and financial discrepancies between the official books and the operational reality. He looked directly at Arthur. Your myth of the self-made man will evaporate overnight. It will be replaced by a much more compelling and legally prosecutable narrative of systemic financial fraud, with you and your son as the primary architects and beneficiaries. Your legal battle will no longer be about corporate control. It will be about staying out of federal prison. The choice, Caleb concluded, leaning back, is yours. Checkmate. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the frantic, panicked breathing of Arthur Henderson. He was broken. The myth he had spent a lifetime constructing had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes by the quiet, meticulous work of the woman he had erased. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was a king with no kingdom, a storyteller with no story left to tell. I looked at him, at his shattered pride, at the raw terror in his eyes. And for the first time in 40 years, looking at this man, I felt nothing but the clean, cold, and deeply satisfying feeling of a perfectly balanced ledger. I stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate. I smoothed the front of my suit jacket. I did not offer a final word. I did not give him a parting glance. My business here was concluded. I turned and walked toward the door, my heels clicking with sharp final authority on the floor. Caleb stood as I passed. He would handle the rest. I didn't look back. An auditor never looks back. They just close the book on the account and move on to the next one. The Henderson Innovations boardroom was Arthur's sanctuary. It was a space crafted to project his myth. The walls paneled in dark, imposing oak, the air thick with the scent of leather and old victories. At the far end, a massive portrait of Arthur, painted a decade ago, depicted him with a visionary gaze, the city skyline behind him as if it were his own creation. For 40 years, this room had been the heart of his power, the place where his word was law. Today, it was a tomb, and the ghosts were taking their seats. The remaining members of the board of directors, men who had grown rich and complacent on Arthur's coattails, filed in with the somber air of pallbearers at a funeral. They avoided eye contact, their whispers dying the moment the door opened. Arthur and Matthew entered last. They weren't escorted to the head of the table. They were shown to 2 chairs on the side, a placement that was both a courtesy and a profound humiliation. They were no longer hosts. They were attendees. Arthur looked shrunken, his once commanding presence reduced to a gray, defeated slump. Matthew was a statue of pure anxiety, his eyes fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table. The chair. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was a throne, custom-built for Arthur, its back higher than all the others, the leather worn to a soft patina from his years of occupancy. It was the physical embodiment of the authority he had stolen. The room fell into a deep, expectant silence. Then, the sound of a single pair of heels clicking with a steady, unhurried rhythm on the marble of the hallway outside. The sound grew closer, each click a tick of a clock counting down to a new era. The door swung open. I entered. I wore the same charcoal gray suit, my armor. My face was calm, my expression unreadable. I held a single, slim leather portfolio. I didn't look at the board members, at Matthew, or at Arthur. My gaze was fixed on the chair. I walked the length of the long oak table, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in the suffocating silence. It felt like walking through 40 years of my own life. Every footstep was a late night, a saved deal, a solved crisis, a silent contribution that had paved the way for this moment. This wasn't a walk of shame. It was a victory lap. I reached the head of the table and stood before the chair for a moment. I could feel the collective breath of the room being held. I ran my hand over the cool, worn leather of the armrest. It felt right. This wasn't Arthur's seat. It had always been mine. He had just been keeping it warm. Slowly, I sat down. The chair was comfortable, solid. It fit perfectly. I placed my portfolio on the table before me, opened it, and looked up, my eyes sweeping across the faces of the men staring back at me. They were looking for a vengeful wife, an emotional victim. They found a CEO. "Good morning," I said. My voice was calm, measured, and carried to every corner of the room. It was the voice they had heard for years on conference calls discussing quarterly reports, but it had never come from this chair. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We have a great deal of work to do. Let's begin." I let the simplicity of the statement land. There would be no rehashing of the past, no dramatic speeches. I was not here to gloat. I was here to work. "Item 1, I began, my gaze moving from face to face, holding each man's stare for a beat too long. "Effective immediately, I am commissioning a full, independent, external forensic audit of this company's financials, operations, and contracts, covering the last 10 fiscal years. Every ledger, every expense account, every partnership agreement will be reviewed. We need a clean, transparent, and accurate picture of this business before we can build its future. The findings will be presented to this board upon completion." A wave of palpable shock rolled through the room. A few of the older board members exchanged panicked glances. An audit. The word itself was a weapon. They were Arthur's men. They knew his methods. They knew how many favors, handshake deals, and creative expenses were buried in those 10 years of books. I wasn't just taking control of the company. I was disinfecting it. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was the first, most fundamental duty of a responsible leader. Know your assets and liabilities. And I had a strong suspicion that several men in this room were about to be reclassified as the latter. "Item 2, I continued, turning a page in my portfolio as if the previous announcement was a mundane piece of housekeeping. "Our company has stagnated. We have been reactive, not proactive. We have relied on old models and have failed to innovate. That changes today. I am creating a new department, effective immediately, the Office of Strategic Planning and Analysis. Its mandate will be to identify new markets, streamline operations, and develop the growth strategy for the next decade." I paused, then looked down the table to a corner where a junior executive sat, tasked with taking the minutes. "Mr. Noah, would you please stand?" The young analyst from the party, the one who had seen my work, looked up, startled. He rose slowly, his face a mixture of confusion and terror. "Mr. Noah," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "In my review of personnel files, I found your performance evaluations to be exemplary. Your financial models are innovative, and your market analysis reports are the most insightful this company has produced in 5 years. You see the future, not just the past. You will be heading the new department. You will report directly to me. Congratulations." Noah stood there, speechless. The board stared, utterly baffled. They had expected a purge of Arthur's loyalists, not the elevation of a near-anonymous analyst. They didn't understand. I wasn't cleaning house based on loyalty. I was rebuilding it based on merit. Arthur built his company on a cult of personality. I would build mine on a foundation of talent. This single act told them more about my leadership philosophy than any speech could. Finally, I turned to the last item on my agenda. I looked directly at Arthur. His face was ashen. He had been a passive observer to the systematic dismantling of his world. "Item 3, I said, my voice returning to its cool, formal tone. "The matter of the company's legacy and future leadership." I let the silence stretch, forcing him to meet my gaze. Henderson Innovations will always be associated with the name of its founder, I stated, and that is a history we will acknowledge. Arthur Henderson will be given the honorary lifetime title of founder consultant. A flicker of something, hope, relief, crossed Arthur's face. It was quickly extinguished. This is a non-executive, non-voting advisory role, I continued, each word a carefully placed nail in his professional coffin. You will retain an office in this building, but you will have no operational authority, no executive privileges, and no access to company financials or strategic decisions. Your input may be requested, on occasion, in writing. You are now a part of this company's history. You will no longer be shaping its future. It was a perfectly crafted cage. I had given him the hollow crown of his title, but stripped him of all power. He was a living monument, a relic to be displayed but never used. I saw his shoulders slump in final, utter defeat. The fight had gone out of him, leaving behind an empty, broken old man. Then I turned my attention to Matthew. He flinched as my gaze fell upon him, bracing for the axe to fall. Matthew, I said, your appointment as CEO has been rescinded. However, your performance in the acquisitions department has been adequate. You will return to your previous role as Vice President of Acquisitions. You will submit weekly progress reports to Mr. Noah for strategic review, and all final decisions will require my personal sign-off. You were given a position you did not earn. Now, you will be given the opportunity to earn one. Do not waste it. It was a far more sophisticated punishment than firing him. I was placing him under the authority of the junior analyst he had so recently leapfrogged. I was forcing him to learn the business from the ground up, the way he should have in the first place. I was giving him a chance not out of kindness, but as a demonstration of my absolute control. I closed my portfolio. The meeting was over. This is the new structure of Henderson Innovations, I announced to the stunned room. One based on transparency, merit, and a relentless focus on the future. You will all adapt. If you cannot, the door is open. My gaze drifted past them, to the enormous portrait of Arthur on the wall. He looked down on the room, a titan of industry in oil and canvas, a monument to a lie, one final piece of business. I said, my voice sharp. Have that painting removed by the end of the day, and send it to storage. The walls of this boardroom should reflect the company's vision, not just its mythology. I stood up. I had said all that needed to be said. The founding was complete. I was no longer the silent partner, the shadow CFO, the supportive wife. I was the majority shareholder and the chair of the board. I was, finally, exactly where I was always meant to be. I was home. 3 years passed. To an outside observer, they were years of quiet, steady, relentless growth for Henderson Innovations. To those inside, they were a revolution. The company I inherited was a stagnant monument to one man's ego. The company I now led was a living, breathing testament to the power of collective intellect. The dark, oppressive oak of the boardroom had been replaced with clean lines of glass and brushed steel. The air, once heavy with the scent of whiskey and entitlement, now buzzed with the energy of collaboration and genuine innovation. The corporate culture, once a patriarchal system of handshakes and backroom deals, had been rebuilt from the ground up on a simple, radical principle: the best idea wins, no matter who it comes from. The forensic audit I had commissioned in that first meeting had been brutal. It had unearthed decades of cronyism and inefficiency. Several board members quietly retired. Others were replaced by sharp, hungry minds from diverse backgrounds, people who earned their seats with their resumes, not their golf handicaps. The company was leaner, smarter, and more profitable than it had ever been in its 40-year history. My days were long, filled with the work I had always loved. I no longer operated from the shadows. I led from the front. My decisions were swift, my logic unassailable, my standards absolute. I poured everything I had into the business, not just my mind for numbers, but my vision for what it could be. And it thrived. Arthur remained. He was a ghost in the machine he had once claimed to have built. He occupied the founder-consultant office I had assigned him, a handsomely furnished room with no computer and a phone that only made outgoing calls. He would wander the halls, a relic of a bygone era, his presence a constant, silent reminder to everyone of what happened when you mistook mythology for fact. He was a cautionary tale in a well-tailored suit. We were polite, distant, the cold civility of strangers who shared a mortgage. The fire of his rage had long since burned out, leaving only the cold ash of irrelevance. Matthew, surprisingly, had adapted. Stripped of his unearned authority and placed under the direct mentorship of Noah, he had been forced to confront his own mediocrity. The humiliation had either broken him or forged him into something new. For Matthew, it was the latter. He worked harder than he ever had in his life. He learned to listen. He learned to respect competence. He was no longer the heir apparent, but he was becoming a capable executive in his own right. He was earning his place, perhaps for the first time. There was a quiet respect in his eyes when he looked at me now, the kind a soldier has for the general who defeated him and then showed him how to truly fight. My true legacy, however, was not in the profit margins or the stock price. It was in the people I was building. Noah, my brilliant young analyst, had become my chief strategy officer, my indispensable right hand. His office of strategic planning was the engine room of the new Henderson innovations, populated by the brightest young minds I could find. They were my real dynasty, a dynasty of talent, not of blood. They were the children of my intellect, the successors to my philosophy. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood in my office, Arthur's old office, now redesigned to be a space of light, efficiency, and panoramic views. On my desk, next to the sleek monitor displaying real-time market data, sat a simple, elegant silver frame. In it was not a family photo, but a crisp official stock certificate. Eliza Henderson, 51% ownership. Beside it, I had placed another frame, one I had kept hidden for years. It was a faded photograph of a young woman with sharp eyes and an ambitious set of the jaw, sitting at a cheap desk buried under ledgers. It was me, 43 years ago. I had finally paid the debt I owed to her. The door chimed softly. "You wanted to see me, Eliza?" Noah entered, holding a leather-bound proposal. At 28, he now carried himself with the quiet confidence of a seasoned executive, but the eager spark of the prodigy was still in his eyes. "The final proposal for the Henderson Foundation," he said, placing it on my desk. "Ready for your signature." I picked it up. This was my magnum opus, the culmination of everything. It wasn't just a tax write-off or a public relations move. The Henderson Foundation for Women in Entrepreneurship was to be endowed with a significant percentage of the company's profits, its sole mission to provide seed capital, mentorship, and strategic support to female founders. I wouldn't just be a success story. I would be a kingmaker, building an army of women who would never have to keep a second set of books. "The launch is scheduled for next month," Noah said, standing beside me. "The press is already calling it one of the most significant philanthropic initiatives of the decade." I signed the document with a steady hand. The ink was black and final. A new history was being written. Good, I said softly. Make sure the first round of grants is ready to be announced at the launch. Of course. He paused, following my gaze out the vast window. The city stretched out below us, a sprawling tapestry of steel and glass, ambition and dreams. For years, I had seen it only through the lens of Arthur's stories. Now, I saw it for what it was, a landscape of opportunity, a place to build. It's incredible what you've done with this company, Noah said, his voice quiet with genuine awe. What you've built. I thought about his words. Built. For so long that word had been a weapon used against me, a lie that had defined my life. Now, it was the simple, undeniable truth. The company, the foundation, the new generation of leaders I had built, all of it, not from the ground up, but from the inside out. I hadn't destroyed Arthur's legacy. I had revealed that it was my legacy all along. I had simply, finally, put my own name on the building. My life was not quiet now. It was not peaceful. It was not the gentle retirement Arthur had so condescendingly planned for me. It was full, and it was purposeful. I had not found peace. I had achieved something far greater. I had achieved realization. I looked at the city, at the endless sky above it. The past was a closed ledger, audited and filed away. The future was an open book, and I was the one holding the pen. I turned to Noah, a faint, genuine smile touching my lips for the first time. Now, I said, my voice filled with the calm, profound satisfaction of a creator surveying her work. Now, we can build.